Let's begin.
All right.
Where did you get your first car?
Well, my first car we always called it the Yellow Bug, and it was designed by Edsel, built at the Ford Motor Company, and it was built as a racing car. Well, after they built it, it was no longer a toy. They didn't know what to do with it, so they gave it to me. And I was 13 at the time, and obviously was not capable of driving a racing car. So they took the motor out and put in an ordinary Ford motor. I guess that would have been Model A times. And I had it. Drove it until I went to college, and my father sold it. I don't think I've ever quite forgiven him.
Speaking of that, I had not planned to ask you about this, but did Henry Ford's cars make a difference for women in this country, do you think?
Well, I'd never thought of that.
Really?
Well, I suppose it did. Well, it certainly has made a difference in my life. I don't know how I'd exist if I couldn't drive. Well, I have learned in the past 6 months, and it's not very fun. And
Great.
So I suppose it made it easier for them to get around.
What's your very, dredge way back to your very, very earliest memory of Henry and Clara? Of Henry, actually, and had the two of them together. Can you remember what that might have been?
No, I remember them being in and out of our home quite a lot. But I don't know what my earliest memory would be.
Let me phrase it differently. What, in those days when you were very young, say in the 20s, can you tell me what he looked like? If I walked into a room and I had to pick Henry Ford out of 100 people, how would I recognize him? What did he look like?
Well, if you'd ever seen a picture, he looked exactly like the pictures. He was very slender. And I don't remember his ever having anything but gray hair.
Really?
Of course, our hair never did gray. And, but if you'd ever seen a picture, you'd know him instantly.
Yeah.
And,
was he an imposing figure?
No, he was a very slender man, not terribly tall. I don't know what, maybe 5'10" or so. I don't know. Men didn't seem to be as tall in those days as they are now. Now, if you aren't 6'3" or 4 or 5, why, people think you aren't very tall.
And what was your feelings toward him? Were you fond of him?
We're very fond of him.
Let's hold on just 1 second until this airplane goes over. Let's cut for just a moment. Let's pick up where we left off. Tell me how you felt about him.
We were never impressed. We just grew up. They were part of our family. And Mrs. Ford, in particular, was very fond of my father. And I think it was because they spent so much time together when they were younger. Mrs. Ford was the third oldest in this family of 10, and my father was the youngest. And he was, I think it was 7 years, it might be I might be wrong on that, years older than Edsel. And after Edsel was born, there wasn't anybody around for him to play with, and so my father went to live with them. And lived with them, what we call the Homestead Corner. I don't know whether you know where it is. He lived with them until he went to high school. And so they became very, very close.
Did they seem as ordinary people to you?
Exactly. And I think they liked to be treated as ordinary people. Well, they were. That's exactly what they were. And they seemed to have free reign of my father's house, and in the same way here. We were welcome anytime.
When you came here, you spent a lot of time in this house and on these grounds.
Well, not a lot, but a fair amount.
Enough.
Yeah.
More than I did, certainly.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
if I were to come to Fairlane in 1926 or 1927, and walked around the grounds, or you showed me around the grounds, give me a list of the things that I would find here: a bowling alley and a little golf course.
Well, the bowling alley was there, of course, but nobody ever used it that I know of. I don't even know if Edsel ever used it when he was here, but I never did, and Mr. and Mrs. Ford never did.
What are some of the other features of this estate that?
Well, when I was quite young, and my sister and I stayed here, of course, Mrs. Ford was very fond of the gardens, and they're not restored as yet. But one of the things I do remember, the large peony bed in the front yard. We named the alleys, the lanes in the peony bed, and with botanical names, which she was determined we would learn. And the only one I remember to this day is Gypsophila Lane, and but all the rest I've totally forgotten the botanical names of the different flowers. But we were very familiar with the gardens, and
What about visiting here in the wintertime? What sorts of things would you do in the winter here?
Well, I remember they were very generous with our friends, and quite often in the wintertime, why, she would tell me to invite some people over, and we would go skating down by the lake. There was a building, not a very large building there on the lake, but there was always a fireplace and, some hot cocoa and that kind of thing. And we'd come over skating with my friends from high school. And they used to do the same thing with the pool sometimes. And my friends really, really appreciated that.
Did you ever see Henry Ford skating?
Oh, yes, he was a good skater. He used to skate up the river to our house every once in a while. She was not a good skater. But every once in a while he'd appear, and the same river goes right below my parents' house, and he'd skate up the river, come say hi, and then skate home again. And of course he couldn't get too near the dam because the water never froze there. And
Just
yeah,
right over there.
but the river did freeze, and quite a bit. We all used to skate down there. I remember as we got older, part of our job was to carry the kitchen chairs down to the ice so the older people could skate more readily. And there were several older people, including Mrs. Ford, who used to skate badly, and they would use the chairs. So,
How would you describe his skating?
well, they didn't have the same kind of skates that they have now.
Yeah.
They were just old-fashioned skates.
Was Henry himself an elegant skater or an average skater?
Oh, just nobody ever taught him to skate, for heaven's sake, Nobody ever taught anybody to skate in those days. You just skated, and if you managed to stand up, that was fine. And
Speaking of teaching,
uh-huh.
what kind of education had Henry Ford had?
I don't know, grade school, probably 8th grade. Perhaps 8th grade, I don't know. And I know my father was, and Mrs. Prunk's mother were the only two in that family who went to high school. And they used to take the Interurban into Detroit Sunday night. And they had jobs and rooms in Detroit. And they went to high school, went to Old Central High School. And then Friday night, they'd take the Interurban back home. And
Getting back to Fairlane, when
Yeah.
you visited here, who were you likely to meet here? I think in your oral history you mentioned various celebrities that you would meet here.
well, of course, Mr. Edison was here fairly frequently. You never talked to Mr. Edison because he couldn't hear you. And but he was in and out. And I guess they were good friends always. I don't know how they could communicate with each other, but they seemed to. And one of the real thrills was when we met Lindbergh, and a lot of the people I don't remember. Perhaps I wasn't conscious enough of it at the time. At the dedication of the village, I'm sure there were a lot of people in town who were in and out, and we met some of them, but I think I told you that they decided I was too young to go, so.
So you didn't go?
No, I didn't go.
You missed a great scene.
Yeah. Well, my mother and father did go, and, told us about it, but,
We have old newsreels of the dedication.
uh-huh.
We're gonna use. Here, roll up. Okay. We have to change film.
Oh.
2019, take 3. I want to talk more about sort of life in general in those days. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the old-fashioned dancing?
Well, I knew quite a lot about that. They were held regularly, I think, once a month. I'm not quite sure of that. But the adult ones were definitely by invitation. And, well, people were thrilled to get invitations. They used to go, and originally I think they were held, I don't know what they call it now. It's an engineering building off Oakwood Boulevard by the Twin Lakes. Now, of late years, they were held at Lovett Hall. And I used to look forward to them, frankly, very much. And they didn't think I was too young for that. So we went. But an interesting thing, he thought everybody should learn to dance. And so they had dancing class. I think it was once a week. I'm not positive of that. Over at this same engineering building for the school children. And whenever our day was, we used to take our little dress shoes in a bag of some sort to school with us, and then walk over there after school, and everybody, girls and boys, went to dancing class. I doubt very much if you could get a class of high school boys to go to dancing class today, but they did in those days. And Mr. Lovett, of course, taught the classes, and we learned to dance.
Why do you suppose he felt it was important for people to
I don't know. He loved it. Maybe he thought everybody should love it. I think perhaps he did think that way quite a bit. The things he liked were good for everybody.
Tell me more about that, about his notions of what might be good for other people.
Well, he had very definite educational things. I think he was very conscious that he didn't have much formal education, and that it was good for people to have formal education. Always, I have no idea whether they financially helped people go to college, but I suspect they did. And I know they were always very, very respectful of teachers and people who had considerable formal education. And
continuing on the dancing, in some of the books I've read, there are accounts of some Ford employees being required to go to the dances. Do you know anything about that?
they might have been. I don't know.
Can you tell me about that?
I at the time, I don't think I was conscious. I liked to go, and I think the people in town who went liked to go. But they were personal friends, and if Ford employees resented it, I wasn't conscious of it, but it's very possible. I think when he said something, everybody jumped. Not necessarily my family, because that was different. He never commanded us to do anything, and we were very fond of both of them.
Did he command people to do things?
Well, he might have. Some of the books indicate that, but I never saw it.
Good. I want to pursue the dancing a little more because it interests me. I was not alive during that period, of course. So I don't know the culture at that time, but in some of the books I understand that the old-fashioned dancing was not quite exactly in touch with the kind of dancing that people might have been doing
Well,
in
it was the
Detroit.
days of the Charleston and some things like that. And
Let me have you start that sentence again, because I was talking when you started.
the days that I went to old-fashioned dancing class were the days of the Charleston, and of course everybody learned to do that. And so the regular dances that were being done were not of that type. They were considerably more athletic, I think. And but I enjoyed the old-fashioned dances, and we used to come over here on Sunday afternoons quite often, the field room, where he'd put the gramophone on, and we'd dance. And sometimes they'd ask, a few other people, but sometimes it was just my family and the two of them. And we liked that. I liked to dance.
Great, great. Should we talk about the Depression a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, what is your own overriding memory of the Depression? When I say the Great Depression, is there anything that comes to your mind?
Of course, I was in college at the time.
I understand that.
And I remember I didn't have any money either at the time. Everybody gets a little low on cash now and then, and that was one time for me. And so I called my father and said, could he send me any money? And he said, well, he could send me $100, but would have to last a very long time. He didn't know when there would ever be any more. And I scrimped and saved and managed to make that $100 last till the end of the year. Of course, things were not quite as expensive as they are now, but, everybody just stopped buying everything they didn't need. I remember debating a long time as to whether I could spend 35 cents to go to see Gone with the Wind. And I did go to see it.
Did you get your money's worth?
Yes, I think I did. But, people stopped having their hair done, and instead of taking the train home at Christmas, I'd take the bus. And so everybody saved that way.
When the Depression first hit, did it make a difference to the Fords? Did it have any effect on them?
I don't think so. I don't see how it could have. Of course, I've never been involved with that much money, but I don't think it changed their lifestyle. They were not extravagant people in any means. And I think perhaps the gardens, that type, the property, was the only extravagance that I could think of. And
let me have you say that again as a full sentence, that I don't think it affected him, or I don't think the Depression had any effect on him, or I don't...
Well, I don't think the Depression had any real effect on them. I don't think it changed their lifestyle, but then they were not extravagant people in any way. The only extravagance I can think of was the gardens, and I'm sure there were a lot of gardeners, and that probably cost a good deal of money. But we were never conscious of money as far as they were concerned.
Did around that time, when there was unemployment was beginning to be very, very widespread in Detroit, and there was a lot of controversy around Ford because he was running into competition and at various points having to shut some of the plants down. Do you have any personal memories of being aware of his attitudes or his feelings toward the unemployed, or toward particularly Ford workers who had been laid off? Or was that something that was not talked about?
I don't recall it ever being talked about. I do know that during that period, I had a number of friends whose fathers were laid off. And people who worked for the Ford Motor Company, nearly everybody in this town worked for the Ford Motor Company in those days. And, but when they'd let me have a swimming party here at Fairlane, those friends were always delighted to come. And that was never... The fact that their fathers were laid off just was never discussed. And, they were cordial. Knew a good many of them by name. And,
Interesting. I have one last question about the Depression. Yeah. Oh. The plan. Let's begin with what was your sense of how the well-to-do thought about the poor and the unemployed?
Um, we were discussing how the ordinary person in Dearborn felt about the Fords, and during the Depression, perhaps some of them were laid off. I suppose there were some really poor people in this town, but I'm not conscious of any of them. Nobody in Dearborn had as much money as Mr. and Mrs. Ford, obviously. And so that everybody was just the same as far as I was concerned. I lived in a bigger house than some of them did, but it didn't make any difference. They were just as welcome there as I was in their houses. And I don't think there was any real feeling. Perhaps with the parents of my friends there was some resentment, but I was never made conscious of that.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about the other way around? Did you have, this is sort of what I asked, following up on a question I asked earlier, was there a sense, did you have a sense of how Mr. Ford might have felt about the very poor in Detroit during that period in the early 30s? Let's pick up where we left off. Your understanding of how Henry Ford may have felt about poor people in Detroit, unemployed people.
I honestly don't think he ever thought about rich people or poor people. I don't think it made any difference to him. He obviously had to know that he was making a great deal of money. But as far as the people he saw, and the people he talked with, and the people he liked, it didn't make any difference. They didn't carry money. They didn't have money in the house. I remember one specific time my husband, this is later, of course, to make an unexpected trip, and we didn't have any money. None of my friends and my father. So we finally came over here and said, could we borrow? I think it was $50 we wanted to borrow. And they absolutely turned out their pockets and pocketbooks. And we couldn't come up with more than $5. So money as money didn't mean anything. And they'd had it so long that I think if they bought something that was expensive, it didn't mean anything either. You know, and
so it just wasn't something.
It wasn't something that they were conscious of.
When the Depression happened, right?
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry to.
Yeah, I know you're talking about the Depression.
It interests me. Did Henry Ford? Did he get it? Did he understand what was going on out there in the world?
I don't know. Obviously, he didn't discuss it with me, and I just don't know. I don't think it affected him, really. They read the papers, and of course we didn't have television in those days, and so I'm sure they knew what was going on, and but whether they were ever affected by bread lines and that type of thing, I simply don't know.
Good. Chopping. Do you remember Henry Ford chopping wood? Remember that the audience will not hear my voice, so if you could use the term chopping wood, that would be
I do know that he did chop wood, and that he believed in chopping wood. Of course, at the time he was born, I suppose everybody chopped wood, but he continued it, and you undoubtedly have seen the carving on the fireplace downstairs, which says, if you chop your own wood, you what does it say?
Twice warmed.
Twice warmed, yeah. And so he did. He chopped wood. I think perhaps of late years, for exercise. I think it was deliberate. I know he didn't chop wood that he used, but
Was he what you might call a Calvinist? That is, a person who felt it built character to do difficult tasks.
perhaps I've never thought of it that way, but it could be. Could be. I think he perhaps felt about the wood chopping as he felt about dancing. This was something that was good for you. Just do it. Keep at it.
Good.
He also rode a bicycle consistently. I have tried very hard to get Don to put a bicycle out here and Don always says, well, somebody will walk off with it.
Yeah. We can chain it up.
I said, well, chain it so it doesn't show. And but that's where the bicycle was, always was, right outside the front door. And he rode it every day.
Did you ride it to work?
No,
Just rode around the grounds.
just around here, up and down the road.
Tell me about the Rouge. Tell me about your memories of the Rouge as a little girl. And can you use the word the Rouge, remembering that people will not hear
You mean the plant?
the plant? What was it like?
Except that I had been there on to see it. I was impressed by the big machinery and the stuff. I didn't really think very much about it. My friends' fathers worked there, but a good many of them worked in the offices, and some of them were in the plant. It was always there, but as a child, and then I worked there after I got out of college.
What did you do there?
Well, I worked in the employment office, and that's when I worked for Harry Bennett. And
Tell me about Harry Bennett.
well, of course, I liked him. Probably the only person in the whole world who did. People were afraid of him, but he was never anything but very kind to me, and he was impulsive, and probably not always fair, but I never saw that part.
Let's hold on 1 second for this jet. Let's cut for a second. Had you heard about him before? 6 minutes. Okay, let's continue
we
on
go
Harry
back.
Bennett. Why were people afraid? Tell me that people
Well, he
were
had
afraid of
tremendous
Harry Bennett.
power.
Pardon?
I'm sure he had tremendous power. I think that's what they were afraid of. I mean, I think he probably had the power to hire or fire anybody. And the people who worked for him were big people. They were, he liked ex-FBI people. There were a good many of those. And as I say, some of whom I knew very well. And he had a grungy little old office down in the basement of over on Schaefer Road, whatever that building was called in those days. And I wasn't pretentious, and I never went to his home. I always wanted to.
Why?
Understood it was quite something. There were secret panels and hidden tunnels and all kinds of things. And it was rumored that, he had a lot of underworld friends and all kinds of things. My dad liked him. My dad used to see him on a personal basis.
What about his eccentricities, like his pistol range in his office and...
Well, I guess he figured he ought to keep up his shooting skills. I don't know. He certainly was handy with it that day I saw it. And, but I suppose sometimes you are so startled that you don't move.
Actually, why don't you tell me as a complete sentence that he had a pistol range in his office and he used to shoot in his office from time to time?
Well, I was conscious that that Harry Bennett had a pistol range in his office, which was not a pretentious office, down in the basement, and he used to shoot regularly. I don't know, but I suspect that some of the ex-FBI men that were employed by him used to shoot with him sometimes.
Great. Your father was a Ford dealer.
Yes.
During the growing up years, were you conscious of the sales of Ford cars going up and down? Any
No.
cyclical? Really,
No.
really. What memories do you have of the dealership?
Not a great many. Of course, we always had cars. And I know at model change time, he used to bring them over and park them around the house there, hide them because he couldn't take them to the dealership before they were announced. But then he had a dealership in Ohio at one stage, and we moved down there. And there again, I wasn't really, we were not encouraged to be very conscious of the dealership, except if anything went wrong, well, they'd fix our cars, you know.
On a different subject,
Yes.
going back to the world of Fairlane,
Mm-hmm.
I've read in the books that there was a point in the late 20s when Henry and I guess Clara also became worried about the safety of their grandchildren.
I've heard about that.
Can you tell me about that?
Just what I've read in books.
You can tell me that.
Well, the books have hinted at it. They were not very close to their grandchildren. And I don't think that was their fault. The few times I was here with the grandchildren, they didn't want to come. And there were always elaborate preparations made. I remember, I don't know whether he had it made or whether he bought it, a miniature farm. And there was a thrashing machine and a tractor, and you know, it was elaborate. And he thought that the boys would have a good time playing with these things. And they weren't the least bit interested and didn't try. And my sisters and I were quite fascinated with the thrashing machine and stuff. But of course, we were girls, we weren't allowed to touch them. And but it's a general feeling I had that they were not close, and no matter how much effort the Mr. and Mrs. Ford made, they just didn't like to come here. I think perhaps it showed.
Right before you went to college in 1930, did communism mean anything to you or to the Fords at that point? If you could try to use the word communism, because people will not hear my voice.
I don't think that communism, as I think of it today, meant anything much to me in those days. The only thing I can think of that might have some bearing on it, or maybe it was due to something else. I had my car by that time, and I was thrilled because I got to do a lot of the errands that my mother was tired of doing, but at the same time it was my job to see that my sisters and brother got to school properly. They used to ride with me, and that was a responsibility. And it may have had something to do with a fear on the part of my parents that something might happen to some of them. I don't know. But I know that we were not allowed to walk alone at that time. Whether there was, a threat of kidnapping or anything like that, I wouldn't have any idea. But I know it was perhaps more than a chore, it was a responsibility.
Right, for the safety of the young.
Well, it wasn't put as safety, but it was put that was my responsibility.
Do you remember hearing about the Ford Hunger March when the marchers went?
Oh, of course, I was old enough to read the papers by then.
Okay. How did you hear about it, and what was your reaction?
Read the papers, probably.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What was your...
I don't remember really discussing it with them. And so that's sort of gone memory.
One other question about the Depression years that wanted to ask. Ford had made many efforts at various kinds of charity
Yes.
for the community in the early years of the Depression. Were you familiar with those? Do you want to
Not,
tell me?
I wasn't conscious of it.
Okay, because
I think anything I remember would be what I had read.
okay.
And,
Okay, I think we are. Let's cut for one moment. I think we're just about done. Let's pretend that you never told me about your first car.
all right.
Tell me about your first car.
You want all about it being experimental and all that stuff?
Sure.
Well, I was in high school, and Cousin Edsel had designed this racing car and had it built. It was kind of shaped like a bullet and was yellow. And after it was built, it was no longer a fun toy, and they had to do something with it, so they gave it to me. And obviously, at 13 years old, I couldn't drive a racing car, so they pulled the motor and put an ordinary Ford engine in the car. And I was kind of intimidated by it. I never did find out how fast it would go, but I suppose about as fast as Model A's would go in those days. And I was underage, so they had to get me a special driver's license. And part of my responsibilities were to drive my sisters and my brothers to and from school or wherever they had to go. Well, at that age, obviously, I liked to drive, and I didn't mind a bit, and I didn't consider it a chore. But as I think it over, perhaps it was a true responsibility. My mother didn't want them walking around alone.
Tell me about what kind of guy was Cousin Edsel? Was he different from Henry Ford?
No, very kind, very gentle. And I didn't know him all that well. We lived a long way apart, and of later years, when I grew up and got into volunteer work and that type of thing, I became very, very fond of Cousin Eleanor and got to know her quite well. But he was gone by then. Edsel was gone by then, so
In the books, there's some discussion of differences between father and son. Were you aware of that?
No, never.
Never aware of that, yeah.
I was never aware of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
No, Mr. and Mrs. Ford did not discuss Edsel.
I just have two last questions. Do you have any painful memories from
No.
the Fords?
No, none.
It was a good.
Very good.
And what's the most pleasant memory you have? The most joyful memory you have of Henry Ford?
Oh, that's impossible to say.
Really?
Impossible. I loved them very much, and not as celebrities, certainly, just as people that I liked.
They were fun to be with?
Fun to be with. No, not fun. They weren't terribly fun. They were very quiet and very reserved. They were comfortable to be with.
Good. That's good.